The Blackwood estate had been abandoned for 30 years, its broken windows staring out like dead eyes over the overgrown runway. Sarah Chen clutched her bolt cutters tighter as she approached the pilot's mansion, knowing that one good haul of copper piping could finally keep the electricity on for her and her 8-year-old daughter. She'd done this before. Desperate times had taught her which houses held the most value and which owners would never return. The front door hung askew on rusted hinges, groaning as she pushed it open. Dust particles danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through cracked glass, and the air tasted of decay and forgotten dreams. Sarah pulled her flashlight from her backpack and swept the beam across the foyer. Once elegant wallpaper curled away from the walls like peeling skin, and a grand staircase curved upward into shadow. She moved methodically through the first floor, her practiced eye cataloguing potential salvage. The kitchen yielded disappointment. Previous scavengers had already stripped most of the valuable copper, but the basement would be different. Basements always were. The wooden steps creaked ominously under her weight as she descended. Her flashlight beam revealed a typical basement layout: furnace, water heater, electrical panels. But something felt wrong. The proportions didn't match the house above. The basement was too small. Sarah had always been good with spatial relationships. It was part of what made her valuable in military intelligence. Buildings told stories if you knew how to read them. This basement was lying. She traced the perimeter walls with her light, measuring distances in her mind. 20 feet along the back wall should have brought her to the far edge of the house's footprint, but her beam hit a newer-looking section of drywall 15 feet earlier. The seam was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in observation. Curiosity overrode caution. Sarah pressed her palm against the suspicious wall section and felt it give slightly. Not solid, not structural. Someone had built this wall to hide something. The bolt cutters made quick work of the drywall. As chunks fell away, her flashlight revealed a dark space beyond. The air that rushed out carried a different smell, stale but preserved, like opening a time capsule. She squeezed through the hole she'd created and found herself in a room that clearly predated the hasty wall construction. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and a desk sat buried under manila folders and loose papers. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the documents looked remarkably preserved. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the nearest folder. Flight 447, Trans-Global Airlines. The date made her stomach drop. November 15, 1993. She knew that flight number. Everyone in aviation did. 200 souls lost over the Atlantic. Mechanical failure, the official report had concluded. She'd studied it during her military training as an example of cascading system failures. But the documents spread before her told a different story entirely. Maintenance logs with forged signatures, radio transcripts that didn't match the official record, photographs of aircraft components that showed clear evidence of sabotage, explosive residue on wing attachment bolts, severed hydraulic lines that had been carefully concealed. Her military training kicked in automatically, organizing and cross-referencing information even as her civilian mind reeled. Someone had murdered 200 innocent people and made it look like an accident. Someone with access to the aircraft, the maintenance records, and enough influence to bury the evidence. At the bottom of one file, a handwritten note made her blood freeze. The cramped writing detailed payment schedules and contact protocols, signed with initials she recognized from defense contractor briefings. But in the margin, in different ink, someone had written a name: Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Dob March 15, 1985. The flashlight slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the concrete floor. The impact made the beam flicker, casting crazy shadows across the damning documents. That was impossible. In 1993, she'd been 8 years old. 8 years old and living in California with parents who had nothing to do with aviation or defense contracts. She snatched up the light with shaking hands and examined the notation more closely. The ink looked fresh compared to the surrounding text. Someone had added her name recently, but why? And how had they known she would be the one to find this room? The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Sarah's military instinct screamed warnings as she quickly photographed key documents with her phone. Multiple exit strategies always have multiple exit strategies. But there was only one way out of this basement, and someone was between her and freedom. The footsteps moved with purpose, not the hesitant shuffle of another scavenger. Someone who knew exactly where they were going, someone who might have been waiting for her to find this room. She stuffed several files into her backpack and switched off her flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the footsteps above seemed impossibly loud. Getting closer, whatever was happening, whoever had left her name in these files, one thing was certain: her life of desperate anonymity was over. The lockbox felt heavier than it should have, its weight shifting strangely as Sarah carried it down the creaking stairs. She'd stuffed the most valuable pipes into her duffel bag, but the metal container seemed to pull at her consciousness, more than the copper that would actually pay her bills. Back in her rusted Honda Civic, she placed the box on the passenger seat and stared at it. The brass nameplate caught streetlight through her windshield: Captain James Morrison, 1962 to 1995. The combination lock was old but sturdy, its numbers worn smooth by decades of handling. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma's school nurse: "Please remember Emma's inhaler prescription needs renewal. Current one expires Friday." Friday, 2 days away. The prescription would cost $60 she didn't have, and that was with insurance covering most of it. Sarah's stomach clenched as she started the engine. The copper pipes would bring maybe $40 at the scrapyard if Mickey was feeling generous. Not enough, never enough. She drove through empty streets toward the 24-hour scrapyard on the outskirts of town, the lockbox sliding slightly with each turn. Whatever was inside rattled softly, not like coins or jewelry, but something more substantial. Documents, maybe, or photographs. At a red light, she tried random combinations. 1962, 1995, nothing. The light turned green and she drove on, one hand on the wheel, the other absently spinning the dials. Mickey's metals sat under harsh fluorescent lights that turned everything sickly yellow. Sarah had been coming here for 3 months now, ever since the temp agency stopped calling. Mickey himself was a rail-thin man with oil-stained fingers who never asked questions about where she found her salvage. "Back again, Sarah?" He emerged from a trailer that served as his office, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "What you got for me tonight?" She hefted the duffel bag onto his scale. The copper pipes clinked together as Mickey sorted through them, his experienced eye calculating value. Clean cuts, good quality, $45. "Make it 50 and I won't come back for a week," Sarah said, though they both knew she'd be back whenever she found something else to sell. Mickey shrugged and counted out 2 20s and a 10. "Deal." Back in her car, Sarah stared at the bills. $50. Not enough for the prescription, groceries, and the electric bill notice that had arrived yesterday. She looked at the lockbox again, its brass surface reflecting the scrapyard's lights. On impulse, she tried Emma's birthday, 0814. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay a pilot's logbook bound in cracked leather. Beneath it, a manila envelope bulged with photographs and documents. Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted out the logbook and opened it to the first page, a dot property of Captain James Morrison. First entry, September 3rd, 1962. She flipped through pages of meticulous handwriting, recording flights across decades. Commercial routes, private charters, cargo runs. Nothing seemed unusual until she reached entries from 1995, the year Morrison had died. His handwriting became more erratic, and strange notations appeared in the margins. October 12, 1995, they're watching the house. Moving the evidence tonight. October 15th, 1995, package secured. Sarah will understand when she's older. Her blood froze. Her name, written in 1995 when she would have been 8 years old. She read the line again, certain she'd misunderstood. But there it was, clear as daylight despite the captain's shaking hand. With growing dread, she opened the manila envelope. Black and white photographs spilled out, showing aircraft she didn't recognize, technical diagrams, and what looked like military documents stamped with classifications she couldn't read. At the bottom of the pile, a birth certificate. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, born August 14, 1987. Father, James Morrison. Mother, Catherine Lynch. The birth certificate slipped from her numb fingers. Lynch had been her mother's maiden name, the name Catherine had returned to after Sarah's father abandoned them. But according to every story her mother had told, her father was David Chen, a medical student who disappeared when Catherine got pregnant. Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the certificate again. The dates aligned perfectly. The names were right. But if Captain Morrison was her father, why had her mother lied? Why had she never mentioned him? More photographs revealed themselves as she dug deeper. One showed a young woman who looked exactly like her mother, standing beside a tall man in a pilot's uniform outside the very house Sarah had just burglarized. On the back, someone had written, Catherine and James, September 1986. Another photo made her breath catch. A small airplane, twisted and burning in what looked like a remote field, bodies covered by white sheets. In the corner, a handwritten note, Flight 447. They weren't supposed to survive. Sarah's phone rang, startling her so badly she almost dropped the photographs. Emma's name appeared on the screen. Mom? I can't sleep. My chest feels tight and the inhaler isn't helping much. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting decades for the right touch. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the ornate brass handle, a headlamp cutting through the darkness beyond the threshold. The air that escaped carried the scent of old leather and something else. Aviation fuel, she realized, though that seemed impossible after all these years. The beam of her light swept across what appeared to be a study frozen in time. Charts and maps covered every inch of the walls, marked with red pins and intricate flight paths that seemed to spiral toward nowhere. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface buried under yellowed newspapers, logbooks, and photographs that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. She stepped inside, her boots silent on the thick Persian rug. The newspapers bore headlines from 1937. Earhart and Noonan vanish over Pacific, and search continues for missing aviators. But it was the photographs that made her heart race. Dozens of them, all featuring the same striking woman with wind-tossed hair and determined eyes, standing beside various aircraft. Amelia Earhart. Sarah picked up one photograph with shaking fingers. Unlike the formal portrait she'd seen in history books, this one showed Earhart laughing, her arms slung casually around the shoulders of a tall man in a pilot's jacket. The handwriting on the back read, A&E and Thomas Blackwood, Darwin, Australia, June 1937. Thomas Blackwood, the name on the deed she'd glimpsed in the front hallway. This was his house, his room, his obsession. She moved deeper into the study, her light revealing more impossible artifacts. A woman's leather flight jacket hung on a wooden valet, the name Earhart still visible on the worn nameplate. Beside it, a navigation chart marked with a route that didn't match any of the official flight plans Sarah remembered from documentaries. This path veered sharply south of Howland Island, toward a cluster of small atolls marked with question marks in red ink. The desk drawers opened with gentle persuasion. Inside the top drawer, Sarah found a leather journal bound with a rubber strap. The entries began in June 1937, written in the same careful handwriting from the photograph. A&E insists the official flight plan is for show only. The real destination lies 200 miles southeast of Howland. She won't tell me why, only that it's bigger than setting records. Says some secrets are worth disappearing for. Sarah's hands shook as she turned the pages. The entries grew more frantic as July approached. The fuel calculations don't add up. There's no way they have enough for the detour and a return to Howland. I've tried to talk sense into her, but Amelia's made her choice. She knows it's a one-way trip. God help me, I'm the only one who knows where she's really going. The final entry was dated July 2nd, 1937, the day Earhart vanished. It's done. The world will think they're lost, and perhaps that's for the best. Some discoveries should stay buried. I pray I never have to use what she gave me, but if I do, at least now I understand why she called it the key to tomorrow. I'll keep her secret, even if it destroys me. Sarah set the journal down with trembling hands and noticed something else in the drawer, a small metal object wrapped in oiled cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing what appeared to be an aircraft component, sleek and impossibly advanced for 1937. Strange symbols were etched along its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and change in her headlamp's beam. A sound from somewhere in the house made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the rooms below. Sarah clicked off her headlamp and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I know you're in here," a man's voice called from the hallway downstairs. "The house has been watched for 70 years. Did you really think you could just waltz in and take what doesn't belong to you?" Sarah clutched the strange artifact to her chest, her mind racing. She thought of Emma, probably still asleep in their cold apartment, counting on her mother to find a way forward. Whatever this thing was, whatever Blackwood had hidden up here, it was connected to the greatest mystery in aviation history. And somehow, impossibly, it felt familiar in her hands. The footsteps were on the stairs now, climbing steadily toward the second floor. Sarah made her choice. She slipped the artifact into her jacket pocket, grabbed the journal and several photographs, and moved toward the room's only window. The roof of the front porch stretched below, covered in snow but manageable. As she worked the window latch open, she heard the stranger's voice again, closer now. "You can run, Sarah, but you can't hide from what you are. Your mother made sure of that." The window opened with a soft whoosh of cold air. Sarah didn't stop to wonder how he knew her name. Sarah's fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the photograph. The woman staring back at her wore a leather flight jacket over a crisp white shirt, her dark hair pulled back in victory rolls that framed a face that could have been Sarah's own reflection from another era. But it was the small birthmark just above the woman's left eyebrow that made Sarah's breath catch, the same distinctive crescent shape she saw in the mirror every morning. The newspaper clipping beneath the photograph was yellowed with age, its edges crumbling. "Aviatrix Elena Moreau vanishes over Pacific," screamed the headline from July 15, 1952. Sarah read the article twice, her mind struggling to process the impossible details. Elena Moreau, age 26, had been attempting a solo flight from California to Australia when radio contact was lost somewhere over the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. No trace of her plane or body had ever been found. Sarah fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate more documents scattered across the metal desk. Flight logs filled with precise handwriting, weather reports, correspondence with aviation authorities, all bearing Elena's name. But it was a personal letter, written in the same careful script that made Sarah sink into the room's single chair. "My dearest James," it began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I need you to know that the flight everyone believes is about breaking records is actually about something far more dangerous. The documents hidden in this room contain evidence that certain people would kill to suppress. I've discovered something about Project Nightingale that goes beyond anything we imagined." Sarah's hands shook as she continued reading. "I know I've kept too many secrets from you, but I had no choice. The baby you believed died in childbirth didn't die at all. I gave her to a family who could keep her safe from the people hunting me. Her name is Catherine, and she has your eyes and my stubborn streak. If I don't return, please find her. She deserves to know the truth about where she came from." The letter was signed with a flourish. "All my love, Elena." Sarah's mind reeled. Catherine. Her mother's name had been Catherine. Her mother, who had claimed to know nothing about her own origins, who had always changed the subject whenever Sarah asked about grandparents or extended family. Her mother, who had died in a car accident when Sarah was 16, taking all her secrets with her. A sudden sound from upstairs made Sarah freeze. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above, deliberate and searching. She quickly switched off her phone's flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness. The footsteps paused, then changed direction, moving toward what she assumed was the kitchen. Someone else was in the house. Sarah gathered up the photograph and letter, stuffing them into her jacket pocket, along with several other documents she grabbed blindly from the desk. She needed to get out, but first she had to understand what else was in this room. Moving carefully in the darkness, she felt her way along the walls until her fingers encountered a filing cabinet. The top drawer slid open silently. Inside, her searching hands found folders thick with papers, small objects that felt like medals or badges, and something that made her pulse quicken, a small wooden box. She lifted it out, surprised by its weight, and tucked it under her arm. The footsteps above had stopped. In the silence, she could hear the faint sound of drawers being opened and closed. Whoever was up there was searching for something, just as she had been. But did they know about this hidden room? Sarah moved to the narrow staircase, listening intently. The sounds were coming from the front of the house now, growing more urgent. She had to risk it. Climbing the stairs slowly, testing each step to avoid creaks, she reached the panel that concealed the room's entrance. Through the thin wall, she could hear furniture being moved, objects being thrown aside. A man's voice muttered curses in what sounded like frustration. Sarah waited until the sounds moved away from the kitchen before carefully pushing the panel open. The kitchen was in chaos. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. Whoever was searching the house was being far less careful about leaving evidence than she had been. But it also meant they were desperate, which made them dangerous. Sarah crept toward the back door, the wooden box clutched tightly against her chest. She could hear the intruder in what sounded like the living room now, his search growing more violent. Glass shattered, followed by a string of curses. She reached the door and slowly turned the handle. The hinges gave only the faintest whisper as she slipped outside into the cold night air. But as she stepped off the porch, she realized her truck was parked directly in the front drive, visible from the house's windows. From inside came the sound of footsteps heading back toward the kitchen. Sarah ran into the darkness, Elena Moreau's secrets burning like fire in her pocket. The copper pipes would have to wait. Sarah's hands trembled as she traced the edges of the hidden door, searching for a way to open what clearly wasn't meant to be found. The wood panel looked identical to the rest of the wall, but now that she knew it was there, she could feel the subtle gap around its perimeter. Her phone's flashlight revealed no obvious handle or keyhole. She pressed against different sections, hoping for a hidden mechanism, but nothing gave way. Frustrated, she stepped back and surveyed the study more carefully. If Captain Morrison had gone to such lengths to conceal this room, there had to be a way to access it. The aviation charts caught her attention again. She approached the desk and examined them more closely, noting how they were arranged. Most showed flight paths over the Pacific, with notations in Morrison's careful handwriting. But one chart seemed different, newer somehow, despite the yellowed edges. It was positioned at an odd angle, as if it had been moved recently. Sarah lifted the corner and found a small brass key taped underneath. Her heart pounded as she returned to the hidden door with the key. This time, she noticed a tiny hole in the wood grain that she'd missed before, so perfectly disguised it looked like a natural knot. The key fit exactly. The door swung inward silently, revealing a narrow room that stretched back into darkness. The air that escaped carried a musty smell mixed with something else, leather and old paper. Sarah squeezed through the opening, her phone's light sweeping across the hidden chamber. What she found took her breath away. The walls were covered with photographs, documents, and maps, but these weren't random aviation memorabilia. Every item related to a single subject, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Sarah recognized the famous aviator's face from dozens of photos pinned to the walls, but many of these images she'd never seen before. Earhart standing beside her Lockheed Electra, shaking hands with men in military uniforms, examining navigation equipment. A corkboard dominated one wall, covered with what looked like an investigation timeline. Red string connected photographs to newspaper clippings, which connected to handwritten notes. Sarah moved closer, her light revealing Morrison's meticulous documentation of every theory, every supposed sighting, every lead related to Earhart's final flight in 1937. But this wasn't the work of an obsessed fan. These documents looked official. Government letterheads, classified stamps, correspondence between military officials. Sarah's hands shook as she read excerpts of letters discussing the Earhart situation and maintaining operational security. A metal filing cabinet stood in the corner. The top drawer was unlocked and contained folders labeled with dates spanning from 1937 to the early 1980s. Sarah pulled out the thickest file, dated July 1937. The month Earhart vanished. Inside were radio transcripts, search coordination reports, and something that made Sarah's blood run cold, photographs of aircraft wreckage on a remote beach. The images were grainy but clear enough to show twisted metal and fabric scattered across coral and sand. Written on the back of one photo in Morrison's handwriting, Gardner Island, July 15, 1937, recovery mission classified. Sarah's mind raced. Gardner Island was one of the many locations where researchers claimed Earhart might have crashed. But these weren't the photos of any public search effort. These looked like military documentation of a recovery operation that had been kept secret for decades. She flipped through more documents and found carbon copies of reports Morrison had apparently written to his superiors. The language was formal, military, but the content was explosive. Morrison claimed to have been part of a classified mission to recover not just Earhart's aircraft, but Earhart herself. According to his reports, the famous aviator had survived the crash and lived for several days on the uninhabited island before succumbing to injuries. More shocking still were Morrison's allegations about why the recovery had been kept secret. References to sensitive cargo and compromised mission parameters suggested that Earhart's final flight wasn't the simple round-the-world attempt the public believed it to be. Sarah photographed page after page with her phone, though she could barely hold it steady. This was the kind of discovery that rewrite history books. But why had Morrison kept it hidden for so long? And why had he never revealed what he knew? The answer came in the final folder. Medical records showing Morrison's declining mental health in his later years, along with a letter addressed to whoever finds this room. Sarah's hands shook as she read Morrison's explanation of why he'd never come forward with his evidence. The truth about Earhart's disappearance, Morrison wrote, was connected to government operations that certain powerful people would kill to keep buried. He'd spent 40 years looking over his shoulder, moving frequently, trusting no one. The hidden room was his insurance policy, proof that would outlive him. Sarah heard a car door slam outside. Her blood turned to ice as she realized someone had just arrived at the supposedly abandoned house. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. The woman in the pilot's uniform looked exactly like her grandmother, Elena. The same dark eyes, the same defiant tilt of the chin, even the same small scar above the left eyebrow that Elena had claimed came from falling off her bicycle as a child in Romania. But this woman wore an American military uniform with wings pinned to her chest, standing beside an aircraft that Sarah didn't recognize. The date stamp on the photo's edge read March 1943. Her grandmother had been a seamstress in Bucharest during the war. She'd told Sarah stories about rationing fabric and hiding from air raids, not about flying military planes for a country she wouldn't emigrate to until 1951. Sarah flipped the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written Elena Vasquez, Test Flight 7, Project Nightingale. Below that, in different handwriting, she knew the risks. The room seemed to close in around her. Sarah grabbed the edge of the desk, her vision swimming. Outside, she heard a car door slam, followed by another. Voices carried through the broken windows of the main house, multiple people moving with purpose. She shoved the photograph into her jacket pocket and quickly scanned the other documents on the desk. Flight logs, technical specifications, and what appeared to be military correspondence filled manila folders arranged in neat stacks. One folder caught her eye: test pilots, classified personnel. Sarah grabbed it, her fingers clumsy with panic. Inside were dossiers on 6 different pilots, each with a photograph clipped to detailed biographical information. She recognized none of them except Elena, listed here not as Elena Vasquez, but as Elena Costas, with a birthplace of Athens, Greece, not Bucharest. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside, getting closer. Sarah stuffed the entire folder under her jacket and looked around desperately for another exit. The room had no windows, just the single door she'd entered through. She could hear voices now, clearer, at least 2 men, maybe 3. Should have been more careful about the locks. Told you someone had been here. Look at those footprints in the dust. Sarah killed the flashlight and pressed herself against the wall beside the door, heart hammering so loud she was certain they'd hear it. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the beam of a powerful flashlight sweeping through the main basement. The old man was paranoid, but he wasn't stupid, one voice said. If he hid anything important, it wouldn't be obvious. What about that room behind the furnace? The one with the heavy lock? Sarah's blood went cold. They knew about the hidden room. This wasn't a random break-in. These people had been here before, were specifically looking for what she'd just found. The footsteps stopped just outside her hiding place. A beam of light swept under the door, and Sarah held her breath, pressing herself flatter against the wall. "Lock's been tampered with," the second voice said. "Recently." The door handle turned. Sarah closed her eyes, clutching the stolen documents against her chest. The folder crinkled softly, and she froze, certain the sound would give her away. The door swung open, and light flooded the small space. Sarah remained motionless in the shadows beside the door frame, praying the angle would hide her from immediate view. "Son of a bitch," the first man muttered. "Someone's been through everything." 2 figures entered the room, both wearing dark clothing and carrying professional-grade flashlights. Sarah caught a glimpse of the nearest man, middle-aged, with graying hair, and the kind of purposeful movements that suggested military or law enforcement background. "Check what's missing," the second man said. "Focus on the Nightingale files." They began systematically going through the desk drawers and file cabinets. Sarah realized with growing terror that they knew exactly what had been stored here. They'd probably catalogued every document, every photograph, including the ones now hidden under her jacket. "Flight logs are here," the first man reported. "Personnel files." A pause. "Shit. The personnel folder's gone. All of it. The whole damn thing. 6 pilots' worth of classified information." Sarah felt sweat trickle down her spine. Whatever she'd stumbled into was far bigger than she'd imagined. These weren't just old war records. They were classified files that people were willing to break into abandoned houses to find. The second man spoke into what sounded like a radio or phone. "We've got a problem. Someone got to the Nightingale files before us. Full personnel records are missing." A crackling response that Sarah couldn't make out. "No, there's no way Miller took them. He's been dead 3 days." Another pause. "It has to be whoever broke in tonight. They're probably still in the area." Sarah's legs felt weak. The old pilot, Miller, had only been dead 3 days. She'd broken into the house of a man who'd just died, and apparently other people had been watching, waiting for their own chance to search the place. The men continued their systematic search, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of seconds before one of them turned toward her hiding spot. She gripped the folder tighter, her grandmother's photograph burning like a brand against her chest. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Sarah carried it to the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly. Emma sat across from her, eyes wide with curiosity, while Danny continued his restless pacing by the window. "Maybe we should wait," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she was whispering in her own home. "Maybe we should think this through." "Mom, you've been saying that for 20 minutes, Emma said gently. "Whatever's in there, we'll face it together." Sarah nodded and opened the folder. The first document was a birth certificate, yellowed with age. Her breath caught as she read the name, Margaret Eleanor Blackwood, born March 15, 1952, the same birthday as her mother. "That's Grandma's birthday," Emma said, reading over her shoulder. "But her name was Margaret Chen," Sarah said, confusion clouding her voice. "She told me she was born in San Francisco." Danny stopped pacing and moved closer to the table. "Keep reading." The next document was a marriage certificate dated 1975. Margaret Eleanor Blackwood to James Chen, Sarah's father's name, but dated 3 years before Sarah was born, not the date her parents had always claimed they married. Beneath that lay a stack of letters, each one bearing the letterhead of various government agencies: Immigration Services, Social Security Administration, Witness Protection Program. Sarah's vision blurred as she tried to process the official language, but certain phrases jumped out. Identity relocation, federal witness, classified testimony. "I don't understand," Sarah murmured, setting down a letter from the U.S. Marshal Service. Mom worked at the bank. She was just a teller. Emma picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. According to this, she testified in a federal case involving aviation industry corruption in 1975. "Look at this signature." Sarah followed her daughter's finger to the bottom of the page. Deputy Marshal Robert Hawthorne. The same signature she'd seen on documents in Captain Morrison's locked room. Danny whistled low. "Your mother was in witness protection. They gave her a new identity after she testified." "Testified about what?" Sarah asked, though part of her was beginning to understand the terrible connections forming. Emma was already rifling through more papers. She pulled out a photocopy of what appeared to be a court transcript. "Listen to this. The witness, Margaret Blackwood, employed as an administrative assistant at Consolidated Aviation Industries, testifies that she observed the deliberate falsification of safety inspection reports for aircraft designated Project Nightingale." The room went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah felt the world tilting around her, everything she thought she knew about her family shifting like sand beneath her feet. "Project Nightingale," she repeated. "That was mentioned in Morrison's files." Danny pulled out his phone and started typing. "Consolidated Aviation Industries, here it is. Defunct company, shut down in 1975 following a federal investigation into safety violations. 3 executives went to prison." He looked up. The investigation was sparked by a whistleblower who testified about systematic cover-ups of mechanical failures. Sarah's mother had been that whistleblower. The quiet woman who had raised Sarah alone after her father died, who had worked double shifts and saved every penny, who had never spoken about her past before San Francisco. She had risked everything to expose the truth about dangerous aircraft. "There's more," Emma said softly, holding up a letter dated just 2 years ago. "This is addressed to you, Mom. It was never sent." Sarah took the envelope with shaking hands. Her name was written in her mother's familiar handwriting, but the return address was a law office she'd never heard of. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have found what I hoped would remain buried forever. I kept these documents as insurance, proof of what I witnessed and what I testified to, in case those who threatened our family ever found us." Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she continued reading. "The man I testified against, Vincent Carmichael, was released from federal prison last month. I have reason to believe he is looking for me, looking for revenge. If something happens to me, if my death seems suspicious in any way, please take these documents to the authorities. Tell them Margaret Blackwood kept her word, but she never stopped watching." The letter was dated 3 days before her mother's fatal car accident. Danny was the first to break the silence. "Sarah, your mother didn't die in an accident. We have to go to the police," Emma said urgently. "We have to tell them what we found." But Sarah was staring at the last document in the folder, a photograph she almost didn't want to turn over. When she finally did, she saw her mother as a young woman, standing next to a tall man in a pilot's uniform. Captain William Morrison. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, Bill and Maggie, 1974, before everything changed. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as the implications crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her mother, standing beside Captain William Hartley in what appeared to be an intimate moment, both of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. The timestamp on the back read July 1987, exactly 9 months before Sarah was born. She sank into the leather chair behind Hartley's desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Everything she thought she knew about her origins crumbled around her. Her mother had always claimed Sarah's father was a traveling salesman who disappeared when he learned about the pregnancy. A convenient lie that had shaped Sarah's entire understanding of herself. "Mom, what did you do?" she whispered to the empty room. With shaking fingers, she rifled through more photographs. There were dozens of them, her mother and Hartley at restaurants, walking along what looked like a lakefront, sitting together in the cockpit of a small plane. The progression was clear. These weren't casual encounters. This was a relationship, a love affair. Sarah found herself studying Hartley's face in the images, searching for familiar features. The strong jawline that she'd always attributed to some unknown genetic lottery. The way his left eyebrow arched slightly higher than the right, just like hers did. The distinctive cleft in his chin that she saw every morning in the mirror. Her phone buzzed. Emma, asking when she'd be home from her job interview. The lie tasted even more bitter now. Sarah typed back that she'd be late, her fingers moving automatically while her mind reeled. She turned back to the desk drawer, pulling out a stack of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was elegant, feminine, and heartbreakingly familiar. Her mother's careful script, addressed to "My dearest Billy." Sarah hesitated. Reading these felt like a violation, but she was far beyond the point of respectable behavior. She was breaking and entering in a dead man's house, and now she might have discovered that the dead man was her father. Privacy concerns seemed trivial by comparison. The first letter was dated August 1987. "Billy, I can't stop thinking about our flight yesterday. When you put your hands over mine on the controls, I felt like I was truly flying for the first time in my life. I know this is complicated, but what we have is real." Sarah's stomach churned. The romantic language felt wrong coming from the practical, reserved woman who had raised her alone. But as she read on, a different version of her mother emerged, passionate, adventurous, desperately in love with a man who lived in the clouds. The letters chronicled a secret affair that had lasted months. Her mother had been married to Harold Brennan then, Sarah realized. She'd never taken his name, and they'd divorced when Sarah was barely 2 years old. Another lie. Her mother had always said they'd married after Sarah was born, a desperate attempt to provide stability. In the final letter, dated February 1988, her mother's tone had changed completely. "Billy, I can't see you anymore. Harold suspects something, and the baby is coming soon. She deserves a stable life, not the chaos that would come from the truth. Please don't try to contact me. I'll always love you, but this has to end." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Her mother had sacrificed her happiness to protect a marriage that had failed anyway. All those years of struggle, of working multiple jobs while Harold drank away their savings, when her real father had been a pilot with property and means. She thought about the aviation magazines that had always mysteriously appeared in their small apartment when she was a child. Her mother's claims of finding them in waiting rooms or buying them at garage sales. The way her mother would sometimes stare at planes flying overhead with an expression Sarah had never been able to interpret. Now she understood. Her mother had been watching for Billy Hartley in every aircraft that crossed their sky. Sarah opened the final drawer and found what she was looking for, Hartley's will. It was dated just 3 months ago. She scanned the legal language, her heart pounding, until she found the section that made her blood run cold. "To Sarah Elizabeth Brennan, my daughter, whom I have watched from a distance with pride and love, I leave my entire estate and all properties therein, along with the contents of my private study. She will understand the importance of what she finds there." He had known. Somehow William Hartley had known who she was and had been watching her, The realization that she'd been observed, studied, evaluated from afar made her skin crawl. How long had he known about Emma? About their financial struggles? About the desperate circumstances that had driven her to this house? She looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just a study. It was a shrine to the daughter he'd never been able to claim. The aviation mystery, the locked room, the careful preservation of evidence, it was all meant for her. She was his chosen inheritor, the keeper of whatever truth lay hidden in these walls. But why now? And what secret was so important that it required this elaborate posthumous treasure hunt? The manila folder trembled in Sarah's hands as she opened it, the yellowed papers crackling like autumn leaves. The first document made her blood freeze, a birth certificate bearing her name, but with dates that didn't match anything she'd ever been told. According to this, she'd been born 2 years earlier than her mother had always claimed, in a place she'd never heard of, Millbrook Air Station. "That's impossible," she whispered. But Marcus leaned closer, his flashlight illuminating the official seal that looked disturbingly authentic. "Keep looking," he urged, his voice tight with concern. The next paper was a medical record detailing the birth of Subject 47B to test pilot Catherine Mills. Sarah's maiden name was Mills, her mother's name was Catherine, but her mother had never been anywhere near aviation. She'd been a seamstress in Ohio, terrified of flying, wouldn't even watch planes overhead without flinching. "This has to be some kind of mistake," Sarah said. But even as the words left her mouth, fragments of buried memories began surfacing. Her mother's inexplicable knowledge of aircraft engines, the way she'd gone pale whenever the topic of the missing flight came up on the news, the stack of unopened letters from the Veterans Administration that her mother had always claimed were bureaucratic errors. Marcus found another document, a project roster for something called Operation Skyward. Catherine Mills was listed as chief test pilot, with a note that she'd been reassigned to civilian protection protocol following the incident. Sarah Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "Look at this." He held up a photograph that made Sarah's legs nearly give out. It showed a young woman in a pilot's uniform standing next to the missing aircraft, the same plane from all the newspaper articles. The woman had Sarah's eyes, her stubborn chin, her mother's smile from decades ago, written on the back in fading ink. Kate Mills, final flight preparation, March 15th. The date matched the disappearance exactly. "My mother was the pilot," Sarah breathed, the reality hitting her like a physical blow. She was the one flying the plane that disappeared, but she didn't disappear. She staged it, Marcus finished. "The question is why?" Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the next folder, this one marked with red letters, Project Termination, Security Breach. Inside were dozens of memos discussing the discovery of unauthorized personnel aboard what was supposed to be an unmanned test flight. Someone had leaked information about the aircraft's true purpose to foreign agents, someone on the inside. The final memo was dated the day after the disappearance. It detailed the extraction of Asset K. Mills and progeny and their integration into civilian identities following the successful elimination of security threat. "They faked her death," Sarah said, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "There was a spy in the program, someone selling secrets. My mother found out, and they had to get her out before she was killed. But they couldn't just transfer her. Too many people would ask questions, so they made it look like she died in a crash." Marcus was studying a map that had been tucked behind the photos. Red X's marked locations across the Midwest, with handwritten notes about safe houses and new identities. Sarah's hometown was circled, with her mother's assumed name written beside it. Catherine Mills becomes Kate Morrison. But who was the spy? Marcus asked. And why keep all this evidence? Sarah found the answer in the last document, a handwritten letter from Captain James Reeves, the same man whose house they were standing in. Her hands trembled as she read his confession, written in the careful script of someone who knew he was running out of time. "My greed cost Catherine everything. I never meant for it to go so far, but the money was too good, and my gambling debts were drowning me. When she discovered the leaked flight plans in my quarters, she didn't turn me in. She tried to help me find another way. But it was too late. The foreign contacts had already moved against the program. The only way to save her was to make them think she was dead, along with any knowledge she might have had. The letter went on to detail how Reeves had helped orchestrate the fake crash, using his position to falsify records and create the evidence of Catherine's death. But guilt had consumed him over the years, especially after he learned that Catherine had been forced to give up her career, her identity, everything that mattered to her. "I kept these records as insurance," the letter concluded, "and as proof of what really happened. Catherine deserves to have her name cleared, her service recognized. If something happens to me before I can make this right, I hope someone will finish what I was too cowardly to complete." Sarah sank to the floor, overwhelmed. Her entire life had been built on a lie, but not the kind she'd expected. Her mother wasn't a simple seamstress. She was a war hero who'd been forced into hiding to protect a secret that could have changed the course of aviation history. And now that secret was in Sarah's hands. The metal box felt heavier in Sarah's hands than its size suggested, as if the weight of decades-old secrets had somehow accumulated inside. She set it on the dusty workbench, her fingers trembling as she examined the simple clasp that had kept its contents hidden for so long. The latch opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the underground chamber. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them against time and moisture, lay a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a pilot's logbook bound in cracked leather. Sarah lifted out the first photograph with careful reverence. The black and white image showed a young woman in a flight jacket standing beside a twin-engine aircraft. The woman's confident smile and determined eyes were hauntingly familiar, though Sarah couldn't place where she might have seen that face before. She turned the photograph over. In faded pencil, someone had written, "M, Final Flight Preparation, July 1937. Sarah's breath caught. M. Amelia Earhart had vanished in July 1937, disappearing somewhere over the Pacific during her attempted round-the-world flight. But this woman, while bearing a resemblance to the famous aviator, wasn't quite right. The facial structure was different, the hair darker. The logbook revealed more mysteries. Page after page documented flights across remote areas of the Pacific with coordinates that meant nothing to Sarah but were meticulously recorded. The handwriting was precise, methodical, but it was the final entry that made her hands shake. July 15th, 1937. Package delivered successfully to coordinates 12 degrees, 175 degrees. Cover story holding, "E's sacrifice was not in vain. The truth dies with me." Sarah flipped through more photographs, finding images of the same woman with different aircraft, different locations, but always alone. There were shots of remote airstrips carved into jungle clearings, of fuel depots on tiny coral atolls, of what looked like a sophisticated communications setup in a cave similar to the one she now sat in. A manila envelope contained official-looking documents stamped with government seals she didn't recognize. Most were heavily redacted, black ink obscuring crucial information, but fragments remained visible. Female pilot recruitment program, experimental long-range navigation, potential for intelligence gathering in Pacific theater. One document made her stomach lurch. It was a birth certificate, yellowed with age, bearing the name Eleanor May Patterson and a birth date in 1905. Paper-clipped to it was a more recent document, a marriage certificate from 1938, showing Eleanor Patterson's marriage to one James William Hartley. Sarah stared at the name Hartley, her mind racing. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Hartley. A grandmother who had always been vague about her family history, claiming most records had been lost in a fire. With growing unease, Sarah dug deeper into the box. Near the bottom, she found a letter addressed simply to "my darling granddaughter." The envelope was unsealed, as if someone had intended it to be found. The letter inside was written in the same precise handwriting as the logbook. "If you are reading this, then fate has brought you to the truth I could never share. I was not who the world believed me to be, and I pray you can forgive an old woman's deception. The mission required sacrifice, Not just my identity, but my right to claim the family I loved more than life itself. Sarah's vision blurred as she continued reading. I could not contact you directly, could not risk exposing what we had accomplished, but I watched from afar as you grew, as you married, as you raised your beautiful daughter. Every newspaper clipping, every school photograph somehow found its way to me through channels I cannot explain without endangering you further. The letter went on to describe a covert operation, a carefully orchestrated disappearance that allowed the real Amelia Earhart to escape growing political pressures while Eleanor Patterson took on a new mission in the Pacific. But the plan had gone wrong. Eleanor had become trapped in her false identity, unable to return to the life she'd left behind. The coordinates in my logbook will lead you to something that could change everything. But Sarah, my dear one, consider carefully whether the world is ready for this truth. Some mysteries are buried for good reason. Sarah dropped the letter, her whole body trembling. The signature at the bottom was clear, with endless love, Eleanor, your grandmother who never stopped watching over you. She thought of her grandmother's funeral 5 years ago, the woman she'd known as Margaret Hartley. Small, quiet, with keen eyes that seemed to hold secrets. How many times had Sarah caught her staring out windows with a distant expression, as if watching for something that would never come? The cave suddenly felt suffocating. Sarah gathered the documents with shaking hands, her mind struggling to process the implications. If her grandmother had been involved in covering up Amelia Earhart's fate, what did that make Sarah? And what was waiting at those Pacific coordinates that could change everything? Outside, she could hear Marcus calling her name, his voice echoing strangely in the underground chambers. The laptop's glow cast eerie shadows across the basement walls as Sarah scrolled through decades of encrypted files. Her hands trembled not from the cold concrete beneath her, but from the mounting evidence that her entire life had been built on carefully constructed lies. Marcus paced behind her, occasionally glancing at the stairs. We need to move faster. If Helena's people find us here— Found it, Sarah whispered, her voice catching. The file labeled Operation Nightingale to Subject Acquisition contained a single photograph that made her world tilt sideways. A young woman with Sarah's exact eyes held a baby outside a small hospital. The timestamp read 32 years ago. That's impossible, she breathed, but even as she said it, fragments of suppressed memories began surfacing. A lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. The faint scent of aviation fuel mixed with perfume, dreams of flying that felt more like memories. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, studying the screen. Your mother wasn't just connected to Thompson's disappearance, Sarah. She was central to it. He clicked to the next file. Look at this manifest. The document detailed cargo transferred from Thompson's aircraft 3 days before his official departure. Among the listed items, sensitive materials requiring specialized containment and personal effects, classified personnel only. But it was the signature at the bottom that made Sarah's blood run cold. Elena Vasquez, her mother's maiden name. She was part of the crew, Sarah said, pieces clicking into place, not a passenger, not a coincidence. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the laptop. All those stories about Dad being a mechanic, about them meeting at some dance, lies. The sound of footsteps on the floor above froze them both. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that definitely weren't Helena returning early from her gallery event. Marcus grabbed the laptop, ejecting the hard drive they'd been copying files to. Back exit, now. But Sarah remained transfixed by the screen, scrolling through more documents. There's something else. Thompson didn't disappear over the Pacific. Her voice rose with desperation as the footsteps grew louder. He landed. There's a whole operation, Marcus. They've been running it for 30 years. Sarah, we have to go. She finally looked up, and the fear in his eyes snapped her back to immediate danger. They could hear voices now, at least 3 people, moving systematically through the house above, professional, organized, not random thieves. They slipped through the basement's rear entrance, emerging into Helena's overgrown garden. The November air bit through Sarah's jacket as they crouched behind a rusted gazebo. Through the house's windows, flashlight beams swept methodically through rooms they'd just vacated. "How did they find us so fast?" Sarah whispered. Marcus checked his phone, then cursed under his breath. "Helena, she's been feeding them information." He showed Sarah a text that had just arrived. "I'm sorry. They have Emma. Do what they say." Sarah's world narrowed to a single devastating point. Emma, her daughter, who should have been safe at her friend's house, was now a pawn in whatever game these people had been playing for 3 decades. "We have to call the police," she said, but Marcus was already shaking his head. "Look around you, Sarah. The police chief, the mayor, half the city council, they've all been protecting this secret for 30 years. Your mother's disappearance, Thompson's crash, even your father's death in that so-called accident." He gripped her shoulders. "This goes all the way to the top." The back door of the house opened, and a figure emerged with a flashlight. Sarah recognized the silhouette immediately. Detective Morrison, the same cop who'd taken the report when her father died. The same man who'd assured her it was just a tragic workplace accident. "They've been watching me my whole life," she realized. "Every move, every job, every place I lived, they were waiting for something." "For you to find this place," Marcus confirmed. "Think about it. That anonymous tip about the copper pipes? The unlocked door? Helena's convenient absence." He pulled her deeper into the shadows. "They wanted you to discover Thompson's room. They needed someone with the right bloodline, the right motivation. But why?" Before Marcus could answer, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Unknown number. Answer it," he urged. A woman's voice, older but unmistakably familiar from some buried corner of Sarah's memory, spoke softly through the static. "Hello, darling. It's time you learned the truth about Operation Nightingale and what really happened to your mother." The line went dead, but not before Sarah heard something in the background that made her knees weak. Emma's voice, calling for her mummy. The game had changed completely. This wasn't about solving an old mystery anymore. It was about survival, and the clock was ticking faster than any of them had imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the birth certificate, her mother's maiden name typed in neat letters beside a date that made no sense. Elena Volkov, born 3 years earlier than Sarah had always believed, in a place called Blackwater Station that didn't exist on any map she knew. The photograph beneath it showed her mother as a young woman, but dressed in clothing Sarah had never seen, standing beside a man who definitely wasn't her father. The basement felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as she rifled through more documents, flight manifests with her mother's name listed as crew, training records from a facility called Project Nightingale, and underneath it all, a thick manila envelope marked with her own name in her mother's handwriting. Inside, a letter dated just 2 months before her mother's death. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've found what I've spent 20 years hiding from you. I pray you'll forgive an old woman's desperate choices. The truth I'm about to tell you will change everything you believe about our family, about me, and about yourself. I was never just a nurse. The man in the photograph is Captain James Morrison, the James Morrison whose house you're now standing in. We worked together on something that was supposed to change aviation forever. Instead, it nearly destroyed us all." Sarah's breath caught. She looked around the basement with new eyes, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't random. She hadn't stumbled into this house by accident. Project Nightingale wasn't just about testing experimental aircraft. We were developing navigation systems that could guide planes through conditions no human pilot could survive. The technology worked, Sarah. It worked too well. The final test flight was supposed to be unmanned, but James insisted on piloting it himself. He said the investors needed to see human capability merged with the technology. The letter trembled in Sarah's hands. October 15th, 1987, 3 days before her own birth. "I discovered I was pregnant with you just before the final test. James was the father, Sarah. Captain Morrison was your father. I never told him because by then I knew someone on the project team couldn't be trusted. I feared for both our lives. The basement spun around her. Every certainty she'd held about her identity crumbled in an instant. The man she'd called father had raised another man's child, never knowing the truth. Her mother had carried this secret through 20 years of ordinary life, through poverty and struggle, and eventually to her deathbed. After the crash, I took my research notes and disappeared. I changed my name, created a new identity, and tried to bury Elena Volkov forever. I met Robert, the man you knew as your father, and he gave us a safe life. He never questioned my past because he loved us enough not to need those answers. But I kept watching, waiting. I knew that someday the people who killed James would realize the technology survived. I hid the most crucial research where only you could find it. In the place where your father died, in the house he never got to return to. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks, her vision blurring. The copper pipe seemed insignificant now, a desperate plan from another lifetime. She was sitting in her biological father's house, reading about technology that people had committed murder to possess. The navigation system is hidden in James's study, behind the bookshelf with the Lindbergh biography. The prototype itself is there, along with all our research. It's worth millions now, but Sarah, it's also dangerous. The people who wanted it buried 20 years ago still exist. Some of them hold positions of tremendous power. If you're reading this, it means you've reached the point where you need what I've left for you. Use it to save our family, but be careful who you trust. The moment you reveal this technology, you'll become a target. I love you more than words can express. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. I was a coward, too afraid of losing the precious normal life we'd built together. Your mother, Elena. P.S. The key to James's study is taped under the kitchen sink. He always said the most important things should be hidden in the most ordinary places. Sarah folded the letter carefully, her hands steadier now, despite the magnitude of what she'd learned. 20 years of questions about her mother's secretive nature suddenly made sense. The way Elena had always tensed when planes flew overhead, her inexplicable knowledge of technical subjects she'd never studied, the careful way she'd avoided certain topics about the past. She gathered the documents, placing them back in their hiding spot, except for the study key. As she climbed the basement stairs, Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. She wasn't just a desperate mother stealing copper anymore. She was the daughter of two brilliant people who died protecting something extraordinary. Now it was her turn to decide what that legacy was worth. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph, her mother's face smiling back at her from 40 years in the past. The woman stood beside Captain Morrison, both wearing pilot uniforms, their arms around each other in front of what looked like a military transport plane. Written on the back in faded ink, Elena and James, 1983. Before everything changed. Elena. Her mother's real name wasn't Maria Santos, as Sarah had believed her entire life. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted her back to reality. Detective Martinez appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Sarah, we need to leave, now." "Wait," she whispered, clutching the photograph. "This changes everything. My mother, she knew Morrison. She was a pilot." Martinez stepped closer, his eyes widening as he saw the image. "Jesus, no wonder someone's been tracking you." He grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "We can look at this later. Right now there are 3 black SUVs pulling up outside." "The service tunnel," Martinez said, pointing toward a narrow opening behind Morrison's desk that Sarah hadn't noticed before. "Where does it lead?" "I don't know. I've never seen it before." They could hear car doors slamming, voices coordinating outside. Martinez was already moving toward the tunnel entrance, testing its width. "It's our only option. Grab whatever else looks important." Sarah's eyes swept the room frantically. She stuffed the logbook, several more photographs, and a manila envelope marked Project Blackbird into her jacket. As she turned to follow Martinez, her foot knocked against a loose floorboard. Beneath it, she glimpsed the corner of what looked like another document. "Sarah, come on." She dropped to her knees, prying up the board. Inside was a sealed plastic bag containing a single sheet of paper. Even in the dim light, she could see it was some kind of flight manifest. The date at the top made her heart skip: September 15th, 1983, 3 days before her supposed birth date. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house below. Martinez had already disappeared into the tunnel. Sarah crawled in after him, the narrow space forcing her to move on her hands and knees through what felt like an old mining shaft. The air was stale and thick with dust that made her want to cough, but she bit her tongue, knowing any sound could give them away. Behind them, she heard voices entering Morrison's study. Search everything. The woman was here recently. Those footprints in the dust are fresh. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever. Sloping gradually downward, Sarah's knees scraped against rough stone, her jacket catching on protruding rocks. Martinez moved ahead of her like a shadow, occasionally pausing to listen for pursuit. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into what appeared to be a natural cave. Dim light filtered in from somewhere ahead, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of running water. "Where are we?" she whispered. "If I had to guess, this connects to the old mine system that runs under half the mountain." Martinez checked his phone. No signal. "We need to keep moving and find another way out." They followed the sound of water through a series of interconnected caverns. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she'd discovered. Her mother had been a pilot, had known Morrison, had apparently been involved in some kind of classified project. Everything about her childhood, her family's history, had been a lie. The cave opened into a larger chamber where an underground stream had carved out a pool. On the far side, Sarah could see what looked like daylight filtering through an opening. "There," Martinez pointed, "but we'll have to cross the water." The stream was deeper than it looked, coming up to their waists as they waded across. The shock of cold water made Sarah gasp, but she kept the documents pressed against her chest, determined to protect them. They emerged on the far side, dripping and shivering. The opening led to a steep ravine about a mile from Morrison's property. Through the trees they could see the black SUVs still positioned around the estate. Martinez pulled out his phone as soon as they had signal. "I'm calling this in, but Sarah, we need to talk about what you found. Those weren't just random documents." Sarah looked down at the plastic bag in her hands, at the flight manifest she hadn't had time to examine properly. The header read, "Classified Transport, Project Blackbird, Passenger Manifest." Below it, a list of names, most crossed out in red ink. At the bottom, 2 entries that made her hands shake. Elena Vasquez, pilot and infant female, designation, Package 7. "I don't think I was born," she whispered, the terrible realization washing over her. "I think I was transported." Harold Carver, the missing pilot whose locked room had started this nightmare. "Mom?" Emma's voice drifted down the basement stairs. "Are you okay down there?" Sarah quickly shoved the photo back into the dusty box, her heart hammering. "Just looking for some old blankets, sweetheart. Go back to bed." But sleep wouldn't come for Sarah. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn, staring at her grandfather's old flight logbook. The dates matched perfectly with the newspaper clippings she'd found in Harold's hidden room. March 15th, 1963, the day Harold Carver's plane had vanished over the Pacific, carrying what the government claimed was routine cargo. Sarah now knew better. She'd seen the photographs in that locked room, the documents that proved Harold had been transporting something far more dangerous than anyone suspected, and somehow her grandfather had been part of it. The phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Detective Morrison's voice was tense. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's been another break in." "Another one?" "The Carver estate. Someone tore that locked room apart last night. Professional job. They knew exactly what they were looking for." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She'd been so careful to leave everything exactly as she'd found it. "Did they take anything?" "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me. You were the last person to see that room intact." Within an hour, Sarah found herself standing in Harold's destroyed sanctuary. The hidden panels had been ripped open, filing cabinets overturned, even the floorboards pried up. The systematic destruction spoke of desperation or determination. "The photographs are gone," Morrison noted, consulting his notebook. "All the documents, too. But here's the strange part." He led her to the corner where Harold's desk had been. "They left this." On the floor lay a single manila envelope, Sarah's name written across it in Harold's distinctive handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter dated just days before Harold's disappearance, along with a small brass key. "Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then James kept his promise and led you here. I pray it's not too late." Morrison read over her shoulder. "Who's James?" "My grandfather." The words felt strange in her mouth. "He's been dead for 15 years. The letter continued, "The cargo we transported that night wasn't weapons or gold, as the conspiracy theorists believe. It was people, 3 scientists who discovered something that certain parties would kill to suppress. When our plane went down, I made sure those men reached safety, but the secret died with me, or so I thought." Sarah's vision blurred as she read the final paragraph. "The key opens a safety deposit box at First National. Box 1847. Inside you'll find the proof of what really happened and why they're still hunting for it 50 years later. Trust no one in uniform. They've been watching your family since James died. They know you're his granddaughter." The letter slipped from Sarah's fingers. Morrison's face had gone white. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I need you to be very careful about who you trust right now." "What do you mean?" Before Morrison could answer, his radio crackled to life. Sarah caught fragments, "Federal agents, warrant, immediately." Morrison grabbed her arm. "We need to go, now." They ran through the mansion's corridors as the sound of vehicles filled the driveway outside. Morrison led her to a service entrance she hadn't known existed. "There's something I haven't told you," he said as they reached his car. "I'm not really LAPD. I'm with a federal task force that's been investigating this case for decades. When your name came up in connection with the Carver house, I volunteered to make contact." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" "To protect you. Sarah, there are people in the government who believe Harold Carver's secret could destabilize everything. They've been eliminating anyone who gets too close." The brass key felt heavy in her pocket as black SUVs surrounded the estate. Through the trees, Sarah could see agents in tactical gear. "Why should I trust you now?" she whispered. Morrison's eyes were sincere, desperate. "Because I'm James Crawford's son. Your grandfather was my father too, Sarah. We're family." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. As sirens wailed behind them and Morrison's car raced toward an uncertain destination, Sarah realized that everything she'd thought she knew about her family had been carefully constructed lies. And somewhere in the city, a safety deposit box waited with answers that people had killed to keep buried. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph, her mother's young face staring back at her from beside Captain Mitchell. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline that Sarah saw in her mirror every morning. But her mother had never mentioned knowing any pilot, had never spoken of anything beyond her mundane job at the textile mill. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice echoing in the hidden room. "Mom worked in a factory her whole life. She never even flew on a plane." Marcus moved closer, studying the photograph over her shoulder. "Look at the date on the back." Sarah flipped it over. In Captain Mitchell's careful handwriting, "Elena and James, December 1987. Our last Christmas before the mission." Elena. Her mother's name. The date made Sarah's stomach lurch. She'd been born in September 1988, just 9 months later. "Sarah." Marcus's voice was gentle but urgent. "We need to look at everything else in here. If your mother was involved with Mitchell before his disappearance—" "She wasn't involved," Sarah snapped. But even as she said it, doubt crept through her words. She thought of her mother's reaction whenever aviation disasters appeared on the news, how she'd always change the channel quickly, claiming she couldn't bear to watch such tragedies. They worked methodically through the remaining documents. Technical specifications for aircraft modifications, correspondence with mysterious government contacts, and financial records showing large payments from unidentified sources. But it was a leather journal hidden beneath false bottom of the metal box that made Sarah's blood run cold. The journal entries were in her mother's handwriting. December 3rd, 1987, James is convinced the government contract is legitimate, but something feels wrong. The modifications they're requesting aren't for weather monitoring. I've run the calculations myself. The electromagnetic signature would be all wrong for atmospheric research. Sarah's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, the journal clutched against her chest. Everything she'd believed about her life, her family, was crumbling around her. December 15th, 1987, I tried to convince James to back out, but he says we're in too deep now. They've made it clear that walking away isn't an option. I'm scared of what they'll do if we don't complete the mission. Marcus knelt beside her, his face grave. Sarah, I think your mother was more than just Mitchell's girlfriend. These entries, she was some kind of engineer or scientist. That's impossible, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. She remembered her mother's uncanny ability with mechanical problems, how she could fix any broken appliance in their apartment with tools she somehow knew how to use, despite claiming no technical knowledge. January 8th, 1988, I can't do this anymore. I've told James about the baby, and he agrees we need to find a way out. We're going to take the modified aircraft and disappear, start over somewhere they can't find us. The research data comes with us. It's our only insurance. Sarah's heart hammered as she read her mother's words. The baby, herself, her entire existence had been the catalyst for this desperate escape plan. January 20th, 1988. Everything went wrong. James took off as planned, but something happened to the aircraft. The modifications, I think they were sabotaged. The last radio contact was garbled, but I heard enough to know he was in trouble. They're telling everyone it was pilot error, but I know better. The final entry was dated 2 days later. I have to disappear completely now. They think I died in a car accident, and I need to keep it that way. I've destroyed all evidence of my involvement except for what's hidden in James's house. Someday, if anything happens to me, maybe someone will find it and learn the truth. I pray my daughter never has to carry this burden. Sarah closed the journal, her entire body shaking. Her mother hadn't been a simple factory worker. She'd been Elena Vasquez, aeronautical engineer, involved in a secret government project that had killed the man she loved and forced her to fake her own death. The copper wiring, Marcus said quietly, in the main house. You said it looked unusual. Sarah nodded numbly. Too sophisticated for a residential system. Because this whole estate was designed as a hiding place. The hidden room, the false walls, even the deteriorated condition of the main house. It's all camouflage. Your mother helped Mitchell prepare for their escape, but he never made it back. The sound of car doors slamming outside made them both freeze. Through the basement's small window, Sarah could see black sedans pulling up the overgrown driveway. Men in dark suits were emerging, moving with military precision toward the house. They're here, she breathed. After all these years, they're still watching. Marcus was already gathering the documents, shoving everything back into the metal box. There has to be another way out of here. But as footsteps thundered overhead and voices shouted orders, Sarah realized that her desperate search for copper pipes had led her into a trap 35 years in the making. The basement felt different now, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Sarah stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her father's journal clutched against her chest, while Detective Morrison's footsteps echoed above like a countdown timer. Emma remained perfectly still beside the workbench, her young face pale but determined. "Mom," Emma whispered, barely audible. "The panel behind the filing cabinet. I saw it move when you opened that drawer." Sarah's eyes darted to where Emma pointed. Behind the metal filing cabinet, A section of the basement wall sat slightly askew, revealing a dark gap. Her heart hammered as she realized what Emma had discovered. Another hidden space, one that even she had missed during her desperate search through the pilot's secrets. The footsteps above grew louder, more deliberate. Morrison was searching systematically, and it would only be minutes before he found the basement entrance. Sarah made a split-second decision that went against every maternal instinct screaming in her head. "Emma, listen carefully. Take your dad's journal and hide in there. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you. Promise me. I'm not leaving you. Promise me." Sarah's voice carried the weight of desperation and love in equal measure. Emma nodded reluctantly, taking the journal and slipping through the gap behind the cabinet. Sarah quickly pushed the panel back into place, her hands shaking as she arranged some old paint cans to disguise the hiding spot. The basement returned to its deceptive appearance of abandonment just as the door at the top of the stairs creaked open. "I know you're down there." Sarah Morrison's voice drifted down, calm and measured. "We need to talk." Sarah positioned herself near the workbench, her mind racing through possibilities. The flight logs and photographs she'd discovered were scattered across the surface, impossible to hide now. She thought of her father's words in the journal, his growing suspicion about the cover-up, his determination to expose the truth, even as it cost him everything. Morrison's silhouette appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. In the dim basement light, he looked older than she remembered, worn down by decades of carrying secrets. "You shouldn't have come back here," he said, surveying the evidence spread before them. "I tried to warn you off gently, but you're just like your father, too stubborn to leave well enough alone. You knew him." It wasn't a question anymore. Morrison nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the photographs. James Chen was a good man, a brilliant investigator. He was also naive enough to believe that the truth always wins in the end. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "You're the one who had him killed." "I didn't have him killed," Morrison said, and something in his voice suggested he was telling the truth. "But I didn't stop it either. By the time I realized how deep this went, how many powerful people wanted your father silenced permanently, it was too late. I made a choice to protect myself instead of protecting him." The admission hung between them like a physical weight. Sarah thought of Emma hidden just feet away, listening to the truth about her grandfather's death, and felt sick. The pilot, Richardson, he was going to expose what really happened on that flight. The passengers who died weren't random victims. They were witnesses, whistleblowers, people who threatened certain interests. Your father figured that out. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "And you've been covering it up ever since." "I've been surviving," Morrison corrected. "Just like you've been trying to survive, breaking into houses to steal copper pipes." "We all make compromises, Sarah. The difference is that my compromises kept me alive long enough to have grandchildren." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the hiding spot where Emma waited, and she saw Morrison catch the movement. His expression shifted, becoming more alert. "Where is she, Sarah?" "Upstairs. She ran when she heard you coming." Morrison studied her face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading lies. "I don't think so. I think she's down here somewhere, listening to every word, just like her grandfather would have done." He began moving around the basement, his footsteps deliberate and methodical. Sarah fought the urge to position herself between Morrison and Emma's hiding place, knowing it would only confirm his suspicions. "You know what the real tragedy is?" Morrison continued his search, running his hands along the walls. "Your father was right about everything. The cover-up, the murders, the conspiracy that goes right to the top of both government and private industry. He just couldn't accept that being right doesn't always matter." His fingers found the edge of the loose panel behind the filing cabinet. But maybe it's time that changed. The drive to the abandoned airfield felt like traveling through a fever dream. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel as Marcus sat beside her, the leather journal clutched against his chest like a shield. In the back seat, Emma slept fitfully, unaware that her entire world was about to shift on its axis. "Turn here," Marcus said quietly, pointing to a barely visible dirt road that disappeared into a wall of overgrown trees. "I never thought I'd come back to this place." The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rusted chain-link fencing and signs warning against trespassing. Sarah pulled up to a gap in the fence that looked like it had been cut years ago, the metal edges now softened by rust and time. "This is where it happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his weathered face etched with pain. Flight 447 was supposed to be routine, a government transport carrying classified documents from one base to another. "Your father was the best pilot I knew, Sarah. If something went wrong up there, it wasn't his fault." They walked through the gap in the fence, flashlight beams dancing across cracked concrete and weeds that had pushed through the abandoned runway. In the distance, Sarah could make out the skeletal remains of a control tower and several collapsed hangars. "The crash site?" she asked. "About half a mile that way," Marcus pointed toward a dark cluster of trees. "But that's not where we need to go. The real evidence is in Hangar 7. As they approached the hangar, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The structure was mostly intact, though one wall had partially collapsed, leaving twisted metal beams jutting into the sky like broken bones. Marcus produced a key from his pocket. "I've been the unofficial caretaker of this place for 20 years. Couldn't let them tear it down, not when I knew what was hidden here." The hangar door opened with a groan of protesting metal. Their flashlights revealed an interior that looked frozen in time, workbenches covered with dust sheets, tool racks still holding instruments from decades past. And in the center, covered by a massive tarp, something large and angular. "Help me with this," Marcus said, grabbing one corner of the tarp. Together they pulled away the covering, and Sarah gasped. Beneath lay the twisted remains of an aircraft nose section, its metal skin blackened and torn. But it was the markings on the fuselage that made her blood run cold, the same numbers she'd seen in the documents from the pilot's house. "Flight 447, Marcus said grimly. "What's left of it?" Sarah walked around the wreckage, her flashlight beam picking out details that told a horrific story. Bullet holes, dozens of them stitched across the aircraft's skin in neat, deliberate lines. "They were shot down," she whispered. "By our own fighters," Marcus confirmed. "I was in the control tower that night. Heard the radio chatter. Your father kept transmitting, saying he was under attack, asking why friendly aircraft were firing on him. The official report claimed mechanical failure, but I saw this wreckage before they cleaned it up. I managed to save this section before they hauled the rest away." Sarah's legs felt weak. She sank onto a dusty crate, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. But why? Why would they shoot down their own plane? Marcus opened the journal and flipped to a page near the back. "Because of what your father discovered. He wasn't just carrying documents that night, Sarah. He was carrying evidence of a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the military command structure. Someone had been selling weapons to enemy forces, using military transports to move the merchandise. Your father stumbled onto it during a routine inspection of his cargo. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity, so they eliminated him. Him and everyone else on that plane. 5 good people died to protect a secret that would have brought down half the Pentagon." Marcus's voice was heavy with decades of suppressed anger. "I tried to speak up, tried to tell the truth, but I was just a control tower operator. They buried my reports and transferred me to a desk job until I retired." Sarah stood and walked back to the wreckage, placing her hand on the cold metal. "All these years I thought he'd abandoned us. I hated him for leaving. He died trying to do the right thing," Marcus said gently. "And now, with these documents and this evidence, we can finally clear his name." A sound from outside made them both freeze. Car doors slamming, followed by the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "They know we're here. We have to go. Now." Bright lights suddenly flooded the hangar as the main doors were forced open. Dark figures in tactical gear poured through the entrance, weapons drawn. "Put your hands where we can see them," a voice commanded through the glare. "You're trespassing on government property." Sarah clutched the journal tighter, realizing that the conspiracy her father had died exposing was still very much alive. The barn's silence pressed against Sarah like a living thing as she stared at the photograph in her trembling hands. Captain James Morrison's eyes looked back at her from beneath a military cap, his arm wrapped around a young woman in a nurse's uniform. The woman had Sarah's chin, her nose, her stubborn jawline, written on the back in faded ink, "Eleanor and James, 1943, our love will transcend any distance." Eleanor. Her grandmother's name that her mother had mentioned only in whispered fragments, always followed by tears and abrupt subject changes. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered to the empty air. The copper pipes she'd come to steal lay forgotten in the corner, worthless now compared to the truth unraveling before her. She pulled out more documents from the metal box. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military records. Eleanor Morrison, née Sullivan. Sarah's maiden name was Sullivan. The dates aligned perfectly with what little she knew of her family history, filling in gaps that her mother had always claimed were lost to time and tragedy. The final envelope contained a thick stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Sarah's hands shook as she untied the bow and unfolded the first page. James Morrison's handwriting was careful, precise like a pilot's logbook entries. "My dearest Eleanor, I know you believe I died in the Pacific, as the records state. By the time you read this, perhaps I will have. But I survived that crash, survived 3 years in a Japanese prison camp, and when I finally made it home, you were gone. They told me you died in childbirth, that our daughter died with you. I know now they lied." Sarah's vision blurred. Our daughter, her mother. "I spent 20 years searching, following paper trails and bribes and whispered rumors. I found her, our Margaret. I found our granddaughter too. You, Sarah. But how could I approach? How could I explain that the grandfather you never knew was alive, had been alive all along when the world believed him dead, when even I was no longer sure who I was?" The letter slipped from her numb fingers. Outside, gravel crunched under approaching tires. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the engine sound, Mr. Chen's sedan. She grabbed the letters, shoving them into her jacket as footsteps approached the barn. The door creaked open behind her. "I thought I might find you here." Chen's voice was soft, almost apologetic. Sarah turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to shield the open metal box. "You knew. You've known all along who I was." Chen stepped into the dusty light filtering through the barn windows. He looked older somehow, the weight of secrets aging him before her eyes. "Your grandfather asked me to watch over you from a distance. After your mother died, after your husband left. He wanted to help, but he was afraid. Afraid of what? Of the same people who separated him from Eleanor all those years ago. The ones who told her he was dead, who made sure she disappeared before he could find her. They had their reasons, classified reasons involving what James knew about certain wartime operations that were never supposed to see daylight." Sarah's mind raced. The plane crash, it wasn't an accident. No, James discovered something he shouldn't have during a reconnaissance mission. Evidence of war crimes committed by American officers. When he tried to report it, his superiors made sure his plane developed mechanical problems over the Pacific. They just didn't count on him surviving the crash. The weight of generations of deception settled on Sarah's shoulders. And now? Chen's expression darkened. Those same people have children, grandchildren in positions of power. When James died last month, they thought the secret died with him. But then reports came in of a break-in, someone accessing his private study. "They're coming, Sarah. Tonight." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of multiple vehicles grew louder, approaching fast. "There's a way out through the back," Chen said urgently. "Take everything in that box." There's enough evidence there to expose the truth, to finally clear your grandfather's name and ensure your safety. But you have to go. Now. Sarah grabbed the metal box, her heart hammering against her ribs. What about you? Someone needs to slow them down. Besides, Chen smiled sadly, I made a promise to an old pilot that I'd protect his granddaughter. I intend to keep it. Car doors slammed outside, voices shouting orders. Sarah clutched the box to her chest, her grandfather's final gift, the truth that would finally set them all free. There's money, Chen called as she reached the barn's rear exit. In the box. Enough to start over, to take care of Emma. He wanted you to have choices he never could give your mother. Tears streaming down her face, Sarah slipped into the darkness beyond the barn. Behind her, flashlight beams swept through the windows as strangers invaded the space where her grandfather had waited a lifetime to tell his story. But the story wasn't ending here. It was finally, truly beginning.